Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's GISS lunch seminar. I'm really happy to have Lettie Roach, who's a new associate research scientist, who's recently joined us about a few months ago at GISS. And she's based at Columbia with CCSR. And today she's going to be talking about the asymmetry of Antarctic sea ice. So she's going to give a little bit more background about kind of work that she does and where she comes from. I just want to clarify that if anyone has any questions, please indicate in the chat. Either you can write the question down and I can read it, or you can just indicate that you have a question and I'll unmute you. We are recording this seminar, so if anyone wasn't able to come, or if you have colleagues who weren't able to come, just let me know and we'll have that posted within about 2 weeks. So with that, Lettie, I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video. But again, I'll intervene if there are any questions. So.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, so now I can't see the WebEx thing. So please just interrupt me if you can't see anything, or I should answer a question. Okay, well, thanks, Clara, for the introduction. So today, since I'm new at GISS, I thought I'd spend a bit of time talking at the start about my background, then go into a bit of a broad introduction on Antarctic sea ice, and then thirdly, talk about a recent project that I've been involved in, looking at the asymmetry in the seasonal cycle of Antarctic sea ice. So I am from Scotland originally, and I did my undergrad at the University of Edinburgh, studying mathematical physics. And I think I kind of just stumbled into climate science. I think I found out about climate science really from the news. I remember seeing headlines like this one from the Daily Mail in 2014. Global warming computer models confounded as Antarctic sea ice hits new record high. And so when I went to choose my research project, I decided I wasn't very interested in theoretical particle physics and ended up picking one that was on sea ice and global climate models. And so as part of this project, we developed a method to automatically tune parameters in HADCM3, the Met Office climate model at the time. And then I applied that to the sea ice simulation. So we basically just optimized the historical sea ice and found that doing so in the past improved simulation of Arctic sea ice going forward. And that eventually turned into my first paper. But kind of on a personal level, I really enjoyed this project and I thought it was really cool to be running climate models. But I also got interested in the sea ice physics that the model was representing with quite blunt parameterizations. And so that led me to move to New Zealand, where I did a PhD in sea ice modeling. This was based at NIWA, the National Institute for Water and Atmospheric Research, but the PhD was granted through Victoria University of Wellington. I was fortunate enough to kind of end up doing a little bit of field work by chance in Antarctica, which led to some collaborations with people who do observations. But the main focus of the PhD was to develop a model for the sea ice flow size distribution. So flows being these discrete pieces of sea ice, which range in their horizontal size across orders of magnitude, even within the area of a typical climate model grid cell. So the main kind of outcome of the PhD was to develop a model for representing the sea ice flow size distribution at the sub-grid scale. So I developed a representation of processes describing how the flow size distribution evolved subject to different sea ice melt and growth processes and interactions with ocean surface waves. So these are cartoons of some of the processes. I then developed a coupling between SICE, the community sea ice model, and the ocean surface wave model, which is now available in the main release of the model as an option, where we simulate coupling with the ocean surface waves. So in the standard sea ice model, they assume that all flows have a horizontal size of 300 meters to compute the amount of melt that occurs at the sides of sea ice flows. So this lateral melt depends directly on the flow perimeter. So in the standard model, it has a constant low value throughout the ice pack. But when we implement this evolution of sea ice flow sizes, then we get much more variation in perimeter. We have very small flows on the edges of the ice pack, so high perimeter, and then larger flows in the interior, and these change seasonally. And then when we looked at this in a coupled global ocean ice model, we found that basically that the ocean surface waves are one of the dominant drivers of sea ice fragmentation, and that this fragmentation has the potential to cause significant impacts on sea ice concentration and thickness in the marginal ice zone through enhanced lateral melt. I then moved to the University of Washington to do a postdoc, and I continued some of this work. I led an evaluation of Antarctic sea ice in CMIP 6 and worked on some more development of the flow size distribution model, including new observational constraints on waves and sea ice, and a scheme to emulate our representation of fracture of sea ice by ocean surface waves, which was originally pretty computationally expensive. Then I started some new projects looking at the impact of high latitude wind nudging on Arctic and Antarctic sea ice. So I'll talk a little bit about the Antarctic sea ice one today, and also the impact of this wind nudging on AMOC, which I talked about at AGU just recently. So if anyone's interested in that, I can share that talk. And then this, the main thing I'll talk about today is this project looking at the asymmetry in the seasonal cycle of Antarctic sea ice. And unfortunately, I moved in September 2019, so I had a few months of normality, but most of my postdoc was on Zoom. So this is our research group in the bottom left. Okay, so why do we care about Antarctic sea ice? Well, it's located in the Southern Ocean, which, as this projection emphasized, connects the three main ocean basins. Changes in Antarctic sea ice have been a key driver of the upper ocean freshwater budget and the formation of Antarctic bottom water. Its presence can help stabilize ice shelves by acting as a buffer against storms. And it covers a really large area. In the winter, the area is about the size of Russia, and it's larger than the Arctic sea ice maximum. And it has the potential to play a large role in the global surface albedo feedback. It also contributes significantly to variability in primary production and marine ecosystems. So we have observations of the aerial coverage of Antarctic sea ice from satellites going back to 1979. And this is actually one of the few things we do have. There's very few in situ observations of Antarctic sea ice since it's so hard to get to, and there's a lot of uncertainty in estimating sea ice thickness from satellite due to uncertainty in snow loading. Here I'm showing the annual average total sea ice area, which over the full record has been increasing in the spite of increasing temperatures. But in recent years, we've had some really large lows, as you can see. So if you take the trend over 1979 to past 2017, the overall trend is not statistically significant at the 95% level. The trends that we see are also quite regionally varied. So although we've had this small overall trend in the total sea ice area, there have been opposing trends in the Weddell Sea versus the Amundsen-Bellinghausen Sea over the satellite record. If I add the annual mean Arctic sea ice extent to the same figure, you can see that the upwards trend in Antarctic sea ice is smaller than the overall magnitude of the decline in the Arctic, but the recent lows are steeper than any of the interannual changes that we've seen in the Arctic. And there's still some uncertainty over the drivers of the observed expansion. Firstly, a lot of people have talked about the role of internal variability in the observed trend. This is quite hard to quantify because, partly because observations before 1979 are very sparse. The figures on the right show a very recent reconstruction that goes back to 1905. highlighting the really large interannual variability in the 20th century. It's been suggested that we're really just not seeing a clear signal of Southern Ocean warming yet, because upwelling currents that bring to the surface deep waters haven't yet warmed due to anthropogenic climate change. There might be a role for freshwater forcing from the Antarctic ice sheet impacting ocean stratification and temperatures. And this is something that Craig's been looking at with the GISS model, but it's not clear exactly what the amount of freshwater forcing we've seen in observations. And some of the model studies looking at this have had quite have found quite different results. There's been quite a bit of discussion in the literature about the impact of ozone depletion on the Antarctic sea ice trend, but a recent study led by Lorenzo Polvani has more or less shown that isn't the case. And then the lows in the recent years have been attributed to changes in the subsurface ocean heat flux and the atmospheric circulation, in particular a change in phase of the SAM and the Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation. Okay, so it's been pretty difficult to investigate these various drivers of Antarctic sea ice change because climate model simulations of Antarctic sea ice have generally been pretty poor. This figure is from the fifth assessment report with the CMIP5 models, and they concluded that there was low confidence in climate model projections for Antarctic sea ice due to the wide intermodal spread and the inability of almost all of the available models to reproduce mean annual cycle, interannual variability, and overall increase of the Antarctic sea ice. In CMIP6, things are a little bit better. Here I'm showing the trend in sea ice area on the y-axis and the trend in global mean surface temperature on the x-axis over 1979 to 2018. And here the hatching denotes trends in sea ice that are statistically significant. So you can see that there are more models with less negative trends and even some with positive trends. And also in these models, other things have improved too, like the regional pattern of sea ice, of the mean sea ice state. But the agreement depends on the time period that you choose. And clearly models that have a faster warming than observations simulate a much faster, well, a strong sea ice loss that doesn't appear in the observations. While I was at the University of Washington during my postdoc, I was involved in a study that I think goes a little way towards quantifying the various drivers of Antarctic sea ice trends and variability and the differences between models and observations. This came out in Journal of Climate last year, and it's based on a series of experiments that we did using the CSM version 1, which is a CMIP5 class model. So here I'm showing that model sea ice area versus observations, and I'm using the CSM1 large ensemble, which is a set of 35 members with differences only in their initial conditions. And so like most of the CMIP models, this shows a decline in annual mean sea ice area over that 40-year record. And then we did 3 extra experiments where we applied a wind nudging in the high latitudes, so polewards of 45 degrees in both hemispheres and above the boundary layer. We did an ensemble of 3 runs, which we started from low, high, and medium sea ice conditions in the large ensemble. And we found that these 3 runs converged quite quickly, and that although you have a mismatch in the early part of the record from about 1992 onwards, these runs really closely track the observed sea ice area time series, including capturing this decline in 2016. And so we can look at this in the same way as we looked at the CMIP6 models with the trend in sea ice area against the trend in global mean surface temperature. And you can see that the whole model ensemble has a warming trend that's stronger than observations. But that as we nudge the winds in the high latitudes, we move the model towards the edge of that range. And so compared to the mean of the large ensemble, we find that when we add the observed wind variability, this gets us around a third of the difference between the observations and the lens mean. We also find that in these simulations, we're able to capture the regionality of the sea ice trends with these, although we don't quite get as much of a red pattern here in the summer. We get this increase in the Weddell Sea, and then this kind of zonal wave 3 type pattern in the winter. And then we did an additional 2 experiments to 2 ensemble members, where as well as nudging the winds in the high latitudes, we also nudged the sea surface temperatures in the model north of the ice edge, so between about 40 and 55 degrees south. And so when we do this correction, in addition to the wind nudging, we find that that's the yellow dot here, that has a statistically insignificant trend in sea ice, and it's starting to line up quite a lot closer to the observations than any of the members. It's brought us outside of the ensemble, the range of the large ensemble. And so when we do both of these things, so adding the observed wind variability and nudging to Southern Ocean SSTs, that we can explain about 70% of the difference between the large ensemble mean and the observations. And these results are broadly consistent with other studies. Zhang et al. In 2020 looked at the impact of nudging only Southern Ocean SSTs, and they found a large portion, but not as large as we got with doing both SSTs and winds. And then Sun and Eisenman in 2021 looked at nudging ice drift only, and they found a similar amount of improvement to nudging winds only. But note that we do come to a little bit of a different conclusion than them, as they suggest that the biases in sea ice drift velocity are potentially responsible for the difference between models and observations. But our experiment suggests that actually the sea ice drift velocity does respond appropriately if forced by the observed atmospheric circulation. So basically this, I think, helps quantify some of the drivers of the Antarctic sea ice trends and variability, but the drivers of the Southern Ocean cooling that we're applying are still unclear. Okay, so now I want to move on to the main part of this talk, which is on asymmetry in the seasonal cycle of Antarctic sea ice. And this was a bit of a side project during my postdoc, working with Ian Eisenman at Scripps, Till Wagner at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then Ed Blanchard Wigglesworth and Cecilia Bitz, who I was working with at the University of Washington. So in the first part of the talk, I mostly focused on trends and variability, and also when I showed figures, these were mostly using the annual mean Antarctic sea ice extent. But there is actually a huge seasonal variation in Antarctic sea ice. On average, the total area covered by Antarctic sea ice varies between approximately 3 million kilometers squared and 19 million kilometers squared, making this one of the largest annual physical and albedo variations on Earth. Here I'm showing the 1979 to 1998 mean sea ice extent seasonal cycle from the NSIDC observations. And I've shifted the x-axis by 6 months to emphasize the period of ice retreat. And so then if I add in the dashed lines the annual harmonic of this seasonal cycle, I think you can quite clearly see that this seasonal cycle is asymmetric. So if I define the ice advance and retreat seasons simply by the maximum and minimum sea ice extent, the summer minimum occurs on February 24th and the maximum on September 20th. And so the retreat period, just the difference between the maximum and sea ice extent, is typically 51 days shorter than the growth period. So I'm going to define this difference between the ice advance and retreat periods as a metric delta. So for the observations, delta is 51 days. And we can compute this for each year of the satellite record. And when I do that, you can see that there is it's definitely interannual variability. but the asymmetry is fairly consistent in time. The retreat is always faster than the advance, and there's no statistically significant trend in this metric over 1979 to 2018. This feature has been noted before, and there are a couple of previously proposed mechanisms to explain it. So firstly, Gordon in 1981 did an energy budget analysis using observations and suggested that the upwelling of warm, deep water accelerates sea ice melt. And this explanation was adopted in the Physics of Climate textbook, who say that in the Antarctic, the warm ocean waters surrounding the Antarctic continent tend to slow down the growth of sea ice in the fall and to speed up the melting of the sea ice in the spring. And then a second mechanism, this was originally proposed by Enomoto and Omura in 1990, and this relates to an atmospheric circulation driver. They suggested that the semi-annual oscillation of the atmospheric low-pressure trough causes sea ice drift patterns leading to fast retreat. And this was based on connections that they identified in observations. And this explanation has been gaining traction in the field. It's been kind of mentioned in a couple of recent studies as a possible driver, including in this review paper by Ayres et al. In 2019, and also an EOS article that was related to that. So it seems to have been gaining more traction recently. But we decided we wanted to try and systematically investigate the physical mechanism driving the asymmetry using observations and a range of climate models. So first, we looked at computing seasonal asymmetry in the CMIP6 models that provided daily historical output. This is over 1979 to 2018. I have the observations as the blue cross. And then the second dot here is the multi-model mean. And so while we had an asymmetry of 51 days in the observations, we find a multi-model mean asymmetry of 53 days, which I think is quite remarkable. So we capture this fairly consistently across those models. And similarly for previous CMIP generations, so this is the equivalent figure for CMIP5, and there definitely is more intermodal spread here. But again, on average, the multi-model mean is close to the observations. And then if we turn to CMIP3, we can't compute the same metric because we don't have daily output from CMIP3. But looking at the monthly output, it's much more typical that the CMIP3 models and their historical simulations have a retreat of 5 months or even 4 rather than 6 months. So we thought this was pretty remarkable given the documented model biases in Antarctic sea ice. So before I talk more about the biases in model trends, but also in the mean state, there are some really significant biases. Even in CMIP6, if we look at the mean sea ice area cycle, there's a very large intermodal spread. And there are even some models that have less ice in the winter than many models do in the summer. And also, if you look at the regional distribution of sea ice, this is the sea ice concentration with models as the first, observations as the first 3, and then different CMIP6 models down here. There's quite a lot of variation in the regional distribution of sea ice concentration, even though this is substantially improved compared to CMIP5 in the spatial distribution. But so we kind of looked at those model results, and given the biases in model simulations, we took this to suggest that perhaps the asymmetry was occurring due to fundamental physical processes common to all of the models, or at least many of the models. And so that led us to then try investigating this mechanism in an idealized model that includes only the most central processes. So we turned to an idealized model of sea ice and climate developed by Wagner and Eisenman, and they have details on it in their 2015 Journal of Climate paper. So this model simulates the zonal mean surface temperature and ice thickness as a function of time and latitude. So we have only one spatial dimension in the model going from equator to pole. The enthalpy in this model evolves subject to solar radiation and albedo, outgoing long-wave radiation, which is parameterized as a simple linear function of temperature, heat transport as a diffusion process, and then there's an ocean heat input term. And then we also have a simple column representation of sea ice physics to describe changes in temperature related to the various cases for open water, melting ice, and freezing ice. And we run this model for 100 years with a resolution of 400 grid points and track the spatial evolution of the T=0 isotherm as our sea ice edge in the model. For each of the different simulations, we tune the outgoing long wave parameter A to the observed annual mean, zonal mean ice edge. And initially, we use the present day values for solar insolation. Okay, so even though this model is really very simple, we find that when we compute our seasonal ice edge, that the asymmetry is in really close agreement with observations. So we had a delta of 51 days in observations, and we actually find delta is 52 days in this idealized model. And it became pretty quickly apparent that there was a very clear role for insolation. In the 2015 paper, Wagner and Eisenman used an idealized form for solar insolation, shown on the top right, which is, I think, fairly common in energy balance models, or at least not uncommon. And when we apply this function, then you have an almost symmetric seasonal cycle of sea ice. You can also see this if we look at the ice edge in the same way as I was showing the ice area before, with the present day insolation and this idealized function of insolation. So then we tried to strip back complexity in the idealized model to see if we could really understand where this was coming from. And as a first step, we removed the ice from the model. So we removed all of this single column physics to describe the formation and melt of ice. And we set the albedo to just a constant open water value. And that's what's shown as the third column here. So in this case, we still have an asymmetry. It's a little bit reduced from the previous value. So we now have a delta of 37 days with a symmetric, so delta is 0 for the idealized insolation. So this tells us that the ice physics amplifies a little bit the effect that we see, but that we still wanted to understand where this kind of 37 days was coming from. So then we stepped back further and got rid of the heat transport term by setting d to 0. And in this case, this is no ice, no diff. We had a very similar result of 35 days, so suggesting that the heat transport is not a large driver of this behavior. So then when we get rid of the heat transport, we have just a series of uncoupled ordinary differential equations for temperature at each latitude. And so these take this form. So we can solve each one of them individually and look at the asymmetry in the temperature as a function of latitude. So just taking the seasonal cycle of temperature and computing the difference between the maximum and minimum temperatures. And so that's what I'm showing here, as the black line is now our value of asymmetry in temperature at each latitude versus in the yellow line for the idealized insolation, which is just symmetric. So we find that if we look at the location of the observed annual mean ice edge latitude, which is about 65 degrees south, that we have a delta of 34 days. So very close to what we had for sea ice area. So we find that the seasonal asymmetry in temperature matches the asymmetry in sea ice extent. So this suggests that we can understand the asymmetry in ice extent if we just can understand asymmetry in this simple equation. So to dig into this, I just decided to consider the annual mean ice edge latitude. So this is about 65 degrees south. And on the right, I'm showing the true insolation. This is the blue line, as compared with its annual harmonic, which is the yellow dashed line. So you can see that compared to the annual harmonic, the true insolation is flat during the period of polar night, where the annual harmonic goes negative, and it's taller and narrower at its summer peak. And so if we look at this, the figure below is showing the difference between those two lines. So you can see you have periods of large insolation and reduced insolation in the true insolation versus its annual harmonic. And to try and explain this, we can use those lines, the S and the S1, to force our simple EBM equation. And I've plotted the results of the EBM equation in the bottom figure. So you can see that where we have a positive anomaly in insolation from November to January, we have faster warming. When we have the positive anomaly from May through June, we have a slower cooling. Then similarly, when we have a negative anomaly from August through October, we have a delay in the onset of warming. And when we go from February to May, we have this negative anomaly in insolation here, then we have an earlier onset of cooling. So it's really very simple that just the relatively brief and intense midsummer insolation peak that we have causes a relatively rapid summer warming and sea ice retreat, followed by a more gradual winter cooling and sea ice growth, as you can see in this very exaggerated cartoon. Okay, so what about the Arctic? Obviously, insolation is concentrated in the summer, and we have polar night in both hemispheres. But we do have some hemispheric differences in insolation due to the current orbital parameters. And when we apply the present-day Northern Hemisphere solar forcing to the full WE15 model, you do get a slightly different seasonal cycle and ice edge. So we have, this is now the gray line. So whereas we had an asymmetry of 52 days in that model for the Southern Hemisphere solar insolation, for the Northern Hemisphere solar insolation, it's smaller at 43 days. But when we look at the asymmetry in observed Arctic sea ice extent, we can see we actually get the opposite asymmetry. So here I'm showing the Arctic and Antarctic NSIDC sea ice observations, and I've just moved the Antarctic by 6 months to match up the seasons. So relative to the Arctic has an earlier maximum and a later minimum. And if I compute the difference between those seasons each year, this delta, then you can see in the Arctic that, as well as having, it does have this year-to-year variability, but it's typically below zero. And also, kind of interestingly, there's no statistically significant trend in this metric over 1979 to 2018, although we have seen big changes in Arctic sea ice. So I think this kind of recasts the problem a little bit, whereas previous studies had tried to explain what was different about the Antarctic. You know, why was it asymmetric as being kind of the thing that we had to explain, and it being the odd one out. Actually, these results suggest that we should expect asymmetry in the seasonal cycle of sea ice, and so it's the Arctic that is behaving a bit more in a way that's harder to understand. And perhaps this isn't surprising, especially when you look at the landmass configurations. You have in the Antarctic, it's really a simpler system where you have a much more zonally symmetric setup, and the sea ice is just free to grow and expand out from the continent. Whereas in the Arctic, we're enclosed by the continents, and so the sea ice evolution is not so free, but there also may be other hemispheric differences that result in this different seasonality in the Arctic, as well as the direct impact of the land mass configuration. There might be other influences from temperature change between land and ocean, and heat capacity, differences, hemispheric differences in clouds, and also in snow properties, and probably you can think of other differences as well. And it may well be that the mechanisms in the Arctic are much more subtle. When we look at the asymmetry in the Arctic in CMIP6 models, there is broad agreement, but the models are not as similar to one another as they are in the Antarctic, and they tend to be in quite poor agreement with the observed value, which is more negative than the models show. They're more clustered around the line of asymmetry. Okay, so to summarize, I talked about a few things today. At the start, I talked a little bit about the role of winds in Southern Ocean SSTs and Antarctic sea ice trends and variability. But the main part of the talk was looking at the asymmetry in the seasonal cycle of Antarctic sea ice. So it has quite a strong asymmetry, the retreat being approximately 2 months shorter than the period of ice advance. Using a range of idealized climate models, we show that the seasonal cycle of top of atmosphere insolation is the primary driver. And this simple explanation is markedly different from those proposed in previous studies who suggested upwelling of warm, deep water or the role of atmospheric circulation. And I think this kind of raises a new question. Instead of why is the Antarctic asymmetric, I think the new question we're looking at now is why isn't the Arctic similarly asymmetric? Okay, that's all I have. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thanks, Lettie. That was a really great seminar. So I have a few questions, but if anyone else has anything that they want to ask, I can't see anything in the chat.
Hi, Lettie. This is Ron. This is real interesting, especially since it seems like it's the Arctic that we don't understand. How did you account for clouds when you thought about solar forcing? I think I missed that. I'm sorry.
We didn't account for them at all. We're just looking at the top of atmosphere insolation. I definitely think clouds are very important, especially for the hemispheric difference. But I think what we try to do here is kind of find the simplest possible explanation, and we found that Antarctic, we don't need to have the clouds to be able to recover the kind of observed cycle. It's just looking at basing this on the top of atmosphere insolation.
Okay, all right. Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any high latitude data sets you could use for clouds? I'm sorry that this is not something where I'm really an expert, but I'm just wondering if there are any data sets you're aware of that you could use to maybe try to figure out if this is important in the Arctic.
I don't know. I'm not a cloud person, but I hope to be able to kind of to work some more on understanding the hemispheric difference, and so that's definitely something that I'd like to look into. But I don't know about the availability of data sets.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
Hi, this is Max. So you have a simple model that exhibits the observed asymmetry, but do you have a way of quantifying why the previously proposed mechanisms don't have very much leverage on the seasonal cycle?
So we did try and investigate both of those mechanisms using the CMIP models initially. We didn't really find anything very kind of conclusive, but we did notice that the upwelling of, when we just compared the hemispheres, So we looked at the ocean heat flux convergence in the CMOP simulations in the Arctic versus the Antarctic. So we were looking at the Gordon suggestion of it being greater in the Antarctic. We found that actually the ocean heat flux convergence in CMOP 6 is generally greater in the Arctic than the Antarctic. But then I think the second mechanism of the atmospheric circulation pattern, I think, and I haven't, I don't have any, this is kind of more of a gut feeling, but I wonder if that could be responsible for some of the interannual changes in the asymmetry. But it's not fundamentally, I think, why it is always so asymmetric, if that makes sense. The other kind of clue we had there was looking at the CMOP3 models, which actually include a model that doesn't have any ice dynamics, the Russian model in CMOP3, and that also simulated a seasonal asymmetry. So you didn't need to have the sea ice dynamics to be able to simulate that faster retreat. But I'm not saying that that mechanism isn't happening.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is certainly satisfying to be able to explain things using a simpler mechanism than those others.
So I'm just going to ask a question because it's related to that last point. Maybe it doesn't make sense because the projections are just not viable at all. But with respect to the seasonal cycle changes in the projections, can that too be interpreted in an energy balance model framework, or is that not?
I'd be interested in looking at, and I haven't looked at this yet, but I would be interested in looking at how the seasonal asymmetry in kind of the historical simulations might relate to future changes in sea ice, like in the forcing scenarios. But I haven't looked into that yet, and I haven't really thought specifically about looking at the seasonal changes in an energy balance framework.
Okay, so we have a comment from Tihan. Tihan, I think you're making reference to a figure that we can't access. Do you just maybe want to describe or ask your question?
Yes. My question is that your picture of SIA in southern hemisphere, this curve is very, very similar to the curve of cold point tropopause, the cold point tropopause evolution. So in other words, the cold point tropopause in August is very high. Then suddenly in 2 months, it is dropped very low. But on the other hand, when it becomes from winter to summer in our hemisphere, from March to July, it gradually warming. So it is very similar to this area. As you mentioned, this sea ice change is predominantly controlled by atmospheric circulation. My question is that, is it possible they are related by same thing, but we don't know what it is? That's my question.
So you're saying that there's a seasonal cycle that is similarly
Cold point tropopause.
Asymmetric in the Antarctic, but in the opposite sense in the.
No, I mean just why you in southern hemisphere this symmetry, asymmetry? Why it is suddenly area just decreased very quickly, and why is improve slowly? This is my question. Why they're similar?
So I'm not sure I'm understanding the question.
So if you show the figure, you show the figure about 3 satellite observation products, Bootstrap, NASA, and OSAF.
So not the time series.
Not Thomas, it is model 40 CMIP6 model and 3 observation.
This one?
No, green line, the black line.
Green line and black line. This one?
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
You see, when it is become larger and larger area, larger, you see, this is very gradual from minimum to maximum. But when it's maximum to minimum, it's quick. This behavior is very similar to cold point tropopause. So my question is, are they related?
So the decrease in ice area is rapid, much more rapid than the growth, right? Yes, and this is consistent across the models. And so this is what we're suggesting is just because of the seasonal cycle of top of atmosphere insolation. So because you have a bunch of insolation in the summer and then not very much over the winter. So I think it's possible that this drives the behavior of other things in the climate system too. So I haven't looked at anything at height in the atmosphere, but looking at the seasonal cycle of surface temperature, I think it suggests that this has a similar kind of main factor being the concentration of insolation in the summer.
Okay, so it may not related with the cold point tropopause behavior. Okay, thank you.
So it could be that insolation is also driving tropopause behavior, but I don't know.
So we have another comment from James where he mentions that they are studying Arctic sea ice conditions and calypso cloud properties. So I think maybe that's a reference to what Ron was asking about a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I'm sure there's people on this call who have a lot more knowledge about those products.
We have can't see any raised hands or any more questions at this point. But I guess I was also wondering just about the first one of the first slides that you shared about the trends and the nudged CSM runs that you showed. I understand that it was both kind of a combination of wind and SSTs that kind of got you that kind of improved. But if you were to actually kind of correlate kind of sea ice trends with differences in the mid-latitude jet in the southern hemisphere, is there a relationship in the models? Or is it not? I mean, because that's one thing one would like to maybe conclude from that result there.
Right. Yeah, I haven't specifically looked at that. But yeah, I guess it's possible that there is.
And then I just had a background question more because I don't understand it. It was a comment that you made in passing where I think you were looking at. It was the spatial distribution, and you had made a comment that had improved moving from CMIP 5 to CMIP 6.
Yes.
So what's kind of the general understanding of that? Is that a resolution thing?
I think I've heard this in terms of other CMIP, other CMIP evaluation studies. It's maybe more that there aren't so many models that are really different from everyone else. So the kind of middle of the pack is probably quite similar, but there are fewer of the models where things look totally different, at least in regards to like the spatial distribution of the sea ice. They look more uniform in this generation, whereas things were really quite different before. And I'm in that slide that I just had up, you can see that the intermodal spread is still huge in terms of sea ice area, but it's smaller than it was in CMIP 5.
Okay, so it's just a few models, yeah. Yeah,
and I think, I think resolution probably plays a role, and a number of, I mean, I think it's quite hard to kind of really attribute it because so many models are changing so many things between each CMIP generation.
Yeah, I was just curious if there was some kind of key kind of change in parameterizations or something like that that I had missed.
I don't think so. And I think there's still, in terms of like the sea ice physics, there's still quite a variety of different like levels of sea ice complexity in the different models in CMIT 6. And it seems like the impacts from the changes in the sea ice physics maybe not that large. Like it's more, I think, related to what's to other parts of the model rather than the sea ice models. Because we now see more consistent behavior, but still with quite a variation in sea ice physics.
Great. So I'm not seeing any more questions at this point, but Lettie, I found this really informative and a really nice synthesis of your work. So I want to thank you again, for this seminar. And unless somebody else has another question, we have maybe about kind of 7 minutes until the hour. I'd just like to thank Lettie, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. We are going to be posting this in a few weeks. So if you colleagues that weren't able to see it, just let me know. And yeah, thanks again, Lettie. And I'm really happy that you're here at GISS so we can talk more about these problems.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, if anyone wants to chat, feel free to reach out, and hopefully I can meet more of you as hopefully things improve going forward.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lettie.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Lettie.